My name is Oliver Katz, and I'm so happy to be here with all of you today. I am a junior political communications major at Emerson College. I have a specific interest in restorative justice, and I also study cycles of oppression, particularly how they impact youth. And today I am so happy to introduce our speaker, Yousef Munayyer. He is a prolific scholar, current head of the Palestinian Israel Program and senior fellow at the Arab Center in Washington, D.C. You can find his work everywhere. I don't have time to list all the places. Our discussion for this session is Sarah Ann Minkin. She is the current director of programs and partnerships for the Foundation for Middle Eastern Peace. She is also an affiliated faculty member at the UC Berkeley Center for Right-Wing Studies. Without further ado, let's give a warm round of applause to our panelists.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for being here today. To Jeremy and the organizers of this important conference for holding this discussion, and thanks to my fellow presenters and colleagues here today. I look forward to engaging with you today. We're witnessing a moment of profound change around the globe and in the Middle East in particular. The past 16 months of genocide in Gaza take place in the context of these shifts. I will frame my comments today along the observation of Antonio Gramsci in understanding interregnums, or intermediary periods between more clearly defined eras. He wrote, "The old world is dying, the new world struggles to be born, now is the time of monsters." First, what is the old world? A hegemonic system that developed over years in the last century of liberal internationalism that posited, in a general sense, that rights trumped the naked politics of power. From the Treaty of Versailles to the collapse of empires to the death and destruction of the Second World War to the institutions and agreements forged in its wake, a series of events led to a set of rules, not rulers, that was to keep order. The Fourth Geneva Convention was agreed to. The Convention Against Genocide was agreed to. The United Nations was formed to prevent a recurrence of world war and a clash of nuclear powers. International law, and at its very core, the recognition of the sovereignty of nations and its fundamental sanctity, was to put an end to the land grabs and aggression that led to one historic conflagration after the other. But it was not to last. It's hard to point to an exact moment when the decline of this old order began, but it likely accelerated in the period of American unipolarity after the Cold War. The old order sustained through decades of nuclear tensions between superpowers, or perhaps we sustained through decades of nuclear tensions between superpowers because of the old order. That possibility is enough to earn it credit. But as the Cold War came to an end, and as the United States, which had been a leading advocate in forming this order, enjoyed a period of unrivaled power, the order itself began to show its limits. The American war on Iraq, a horrific and destabilizing war hypocritically packaged by Washington as an endeavor for freedom, democracy, and human rights, was perhaps the most significant catalyst in the order's decline. In the years that followed, Western tolerance for strongmen against popular uprisings that sought genuine democratic change led to wars and refugees, which would further test the West's commitment to rights and values over interests. The result has been a wave of right-wing nativist and isolationist parties gaining power. Now, it's important to note here that Israel has always been in tension with this order to a certain degree. At its founding, there was the complete disregard for the self-determination of Palestinians, followed by the thorough ethnic cleansing of the Nakba, all while Israel adopted the UN Declaration of Human Rights and was granted full membership into the international body. The dissonance was apparent, perhaps most clearly for Palestinians, and then for the decolonizing world, while Western powers were most comfortable turning a blind eye. So maybe it is fitting then that Israel, that flimsy stone laid at the foundational stage of this post-war order, play such a prominent role during its ultimate demise. During the Biden administration, which came into power claiming to put, quote, human rights at the center of its foreign policy, its hypocritical support for Israel was accentuated by its desire to push Russia back in Ukraine while standing with European allies. At the same time that the Biden administration was speaking of international law violations in Ukraine, it was funding them in Gaza. While it welcomed ICC decisions against Putin, it condemned ICC decisions against Netanyahu. While it mobilized international support in diplomatic forums like the United Nations to isolate Russia, it isolated itself with veto after veto to keep Israel's genocidal army on the march. Skeptics of the international order had long understood it to be an instrument of power rather than an instrument to constrain power. But the blatant hypocrisy of the Biden administration, which was made more insulting with every smirk from Matt Miller and every tear from John Kirby, turned skeptics into the majority. The hegemony of the order had shattered. Enter Donald Trump. Unlike Biden, who pretended to care for a rules-based order while funding genocide, Trump doesn't even bother with the pretending. He's skipped straight to the imperialist endeavor of annexing Greenland and the Panama Canal, tariff wars, and gutting birthright citizenship. He's removed even the most minor American sanctions on Israeli settlers precisely as they rampage more violently through the West Bank, and he threatens to sanction international courts and any who help hold Israeli war criminals accountable. If the old order began with diplomatic conventions around protecting civilians in wartime, it has died with corporate billionaires who rushed to test their AI products with the Israeli military on the children of Gaza, standing behind the, quote, leader of the free world at his inauguration. And so what is the new world that is struggling to be born? The truth is we don't know, and there might be some time before we find out. We see the signs of it, however, in the contentious politics of this moment. We see signs of it on the college campuses across the West, which have erupted in protest and erected encampments to dissent from the policies that support the genocide. We see it dressed in the lawyerly robes before the International Court of Justice. We see signs of it in the opinion polls. We see it on social media, and we see it in the sumud of Palestinians in Gaza. Perhaps we will see much more of it when Western journalists finally make their way into Gaza and report to their audiences the extent of the barbarity carried out by the Israeli military there. But the old doesn't die easy, and importantly, it fights hardest on its way out. Gramsci tells us that the power of cultural hegemony is that it is so widely accepted that it is not questioned and not even noticed. It's just the way things are. When ideas have reached a degree of hegemonic acceptance, they wield power without coercion. It's when hegemony shakes, when many begin questioning the validity of the current order, that coercion becomes increasingly necessary for maintaining a grip on power. This is precisely the stage that we are in as Trump comes to power in the United States again. For several years now, we've been in a situation in the United States where public opinion on U.S. support for Israel has shifted in a more critical direction. What was once unquestioned has come to be routinely questioned at the popular level among large swaths of the American public. Two key prior catalysts for this shift were the Israeli wars on Gaza in 2008 and 2009, and the war on Gaza in 2014. You can imagine the sort of impact 16 months of genocide will have compared to these prior wars, which lasted a matter of weeks. Realizing this, the forces seeking to maintain U.S. support for Israel, chiefly the Israeli government and its allied partners in the United States, began efforts to crack down on activism and dissent against U.S. policy. In the words of Israeli government officials, when it came to responding to global activism calling out Israeli abuses, it was time to, quote, shift from defense to offense. The earliest stages of this saw the drafting and passage of anti-BDS laws in the United States, followed by intense lawfare, and then the passage of anti-Semitism definitions across various governments and institutions regulating speech and imposing crackdowns for those that failed to comply. But as children were being slaughtered in Gaza, masses of Americans, particularly but not exclusively from its younger generation, took to the streets and their campus greens to protest and demand the end of the genocide. Many American Zionists were shocked by the scale, scope, and speed of this mobilization, in part because they believed that the events of October 7th would create greater empathy for Israel as the victim. But such an outcome relied on a narrative context that Israel itself had been destroying with every bomb they've dropped on Gaza over the last 20 years. Thus, the effort to organize a crackdown went into overdrive. The Israeli newspaper Yediot Ahronot reported in November of 2023 that Israeli ministries working with the pro-Israel American philanthropists sought to coordinate pressure campaigns on American universities. University presidents were summoned before Congress to be berated and embarrassed in show trials and were later forced to resign. Lawsuits from dutiful Zionist lawfare actors sought to compel universities to crack down further, alleging discrimination. Police were called onto our campuses to violently break up encampments in massively publicized instances at Columbia, UCLA, and elsewhere, even though the vast majority of protest activity was peaceful, and the vast majority of violence recorded at such protests were instigated by counter-protesters. Campus was just one place where this repression took place. Congress teed up all sorts of repressive legislation as well, including some that will likely pass this year, targeting the ICC, UN agencies, and NGOs who challenge the pro-Israel line. At the political level, pro-Israel interest groups have invested more money in shaping US politics than ever before. AIPAC alone spent a record amount on congressional races, targeting progressive Democrats who spoke out about Israel. Hundreds of millions of dollars were spent by pro-Israel donors to elect Trump, including $100 million from Miriam Adelson alone. All of this is emblematic of the top-down power plays that characterize the coercive era we are in as hegemony shakes. Students protest genocide? No problem. Demand university administrators arrest them. If the administrators don't cooperate, fine. Withdraw donations and drag them before Congress. Is there dissent in Congress? Okay. Spend historic sums to unseat critics and intimidate others. Social media platforms permit dissent on Palestine? Then just demand that they adhere to pro-Israel speech codes and drag them before Congress, or shut them down if they don't. All of this repression is happening because it is required to cling to a crumbling status quo for as long as possible. While I ultimately believe this will backfire as people will increasingly recognize it for the naked and desperate coercion that it is, it's not clear how long that may take, and pro-Israel forces remain committed to pressing on further. Now in the White House, they have an ally who speaks of ethnically cleansing millions of people as if he's rearranging his sock drawers. And so this is the time of monsters. As we move away from an era where rights and norms have value to something else, the interregnum is defined by power being the only value that matters. So what does this mean for Palestinians at this moment? While there are numerous implications here, I want to focus on a crucial one that is also particularly important for this audience to understand. The iron wall is failing. Jabotinsky's essay, which turned a century old about a month after October 7th, 2023, is often cited for many things. Its importance as a shaper of Israeli ideology and strategy, its characterization of Zionism as a colonial enterprise, its unapologetic commitment to violence as a necessity, among others. But here I want to talk about an aspect of the iron wall which is just as important and perhaps more so in this moment: the aspect of hope. Jabotinsky was opposed to an agreement with the Arabs of Palestine at the time. He understood that they were a native people, that Zionists should expect Palestinian resistance, and that this was merely the only natural course the confrontation between Zionism and Palestinians could take. And yet, he imagined an eventual agreement. Even if an agreement was not possible a century ago, in his vision, there existed a threshold of violence over time beyond which the Arabs, as he called them, a living people, would essentially give up and concede to an agreement with Zionism. Mere paragraphs before this, he wrote, "Colonization," I quote, "can have only one aim, and Palestine Arabs cannot accept this aim. It lies in the very nature of things, and in this particular regard, nature cannot be changed. And yet he is able to leap from that conclusion to the conclusion that an agreement will eventually be possible. How can this be? Hope, a naive hope for sure, that somehow this circle can be squared. But this hope is also vital for the Zionist project itself. The project is not merely an idea on paper, but a material reality that requires people, many of them, to remain committed to it. That commitment, in turn, if it is to sustain over time, requires a belief not just that great sacrifices for the project are worthy, but also that at some point it will no longer be necessary to sacrifice greatly for the project. A century after the Iron Wall's publication, that horizon has never seemed further away. On October 7th, despite being besieged, repeatedly bombarded, and far outmatched conventionally, stateless Palestinians from Gaza inflicted the most significant losses on Israel in decades. What followed from the Israeli military was genocidal-level violence, the likes of which we had not previously seen in this context. All of this is happening at a tremendously vulnerable moment in time in Israeli society, which was locked in a battle over the very nature of its existence between a more secular Zionist wing that is increasingly bearing the burdens of state militarism while dwindling in numbers, and a more religious wing which is reaping the state's benefits and rapidly growing as a proportion of the population. Despite unprecedented levels of violence, we do not seem to be on the cusp of Jabotinsky's eventual agreement. Here I want to recall another section of the essay, perhaps the most important not for what it states, but for what it doesn't. And that is the section on whether Zionism is, quote, moral and just. Either Zionism is moral and just, Jabotinsky writes, or it is immoral and unjust. But that is a question that we should have settled before we became Zionists. Actually, we've settled that question, and in the affirmative. We hold that Zionism is moral and just, and since it is moral and just, justice must be done, no matter what Joseph or Simon or Ivan or Ahmed agree with it or not. There is no other morality. That's it. No room for introspection. No room for rethinking the project. No way to go but through those who object. If violent coercion does not lead to them accepting their subjugation, as Jabotinsky had hoped, what then, if anything can be done in support of this project? What then, if there is, as he wrote, no other morality? There's only elimination. This is the stage we are in now. The choice that Zionist discourse has centered on is not the choice the late Jimmy Carter had once famously laid out in the title of his book, Peace or Apartheid. Rather, it is a choice between apartheid or genocide and ethnic cleansing. I could go through a list of statements from officials, opinion shapers, and other Zionist leaders calling for genocide or ethnic cleansing in recent months and years, but this crowd is probably familiar with them. We've arrived at an intersection where Zionist discourse has overwhelmingly ruled out Palestinian self-determination, while simultaneously realizing how naive the Iron Wall's hope for an agreement through coercion was, and all at the same time as international conditions have never been more supportive of Zionist militancy. This is a monstrous time indeed. Palestinians will have plenty to say about this, and you will see it in their resistance in various forms, but it is not enough. We must all ask ourselves what steps we are taking to prevent the destruction of Palestinians as we stand at that precipice. We must ask ourselves this question now, so that our children and grandchildren will not have to ask us why we failed. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yousef. Sobering isn't the word, because I think we were sober going into this. Maybe some people don't want to be sober after what you just said. I'm reminded that Omer Bartov, when he spoke earlier, we are in genocide, and also it's failed ethnic cleansing, which will lead to more genocide. And you just presented us again, it's apartheid or elimination. We are in the elimination stage. And you're speaking to this conference on the Jewish left. Thank you for being here. You have a lot of demands on your time. No one has used the word liberation in this room today yet that I've heard, but we often tend to think that we're talking about a project of Jewish liberation or Palestinian liberation, and sometimes people conflate the two. A lot of people, I think, on the Jewish left conflate the two, that when we're working for Jewish liberation, when we're working for Palestinian liberation, well, I can't even say the equation correctly. Basically, for Jews to be liberated, we have to work for Palestinian liberation, because we will never be free, we will never be liberated while we are oppressing Palestinians. And I say Jews writ large because we're all a part of the oppression project here. But I actually think that these are two separate projects that have points of overlap, Jewish liberation and Palestinian liberation, which we can unpack more, but really I'm laying this out because I want to ask you if and where you see Jewish liberation overlapping with Palestinian liberation. And I want to ask you that to get to my real question. Here you are speaking to this very motivated audience of the Jewish left. You ended by telling us there are steps we need to take for the sake of how we can answer to the next generation, who we're already answering to. And I want to ask you to tell us those steps, and specifically, what are the steps that you think the Jewish left needs to take? And what are the steps that you want the Jewish left to know about or understand that Palestinians are taking?
Well, thank you for that. It's funny, over lunch somebody asked me a similar question about being at this particular conference and so on, and what it means to be a Palestinian speaking to this audience. And I don't only think about it in those terms. I also think about the fact that as an American citizen sitting in a room with many American citizens who care about this issue, we have a unique responsibility to address our complicity and our government's complicity in the genocide.
Thank you.
And I will speak in every room like that is available. I also think that there are overlaps, for sure. We've talked about these themes throughout the day. I wanted to frame my discussion around the changing global order because I think, yes, Palestinians are uniquely threatened by this, but we are by far not the only people who are threatened by this. We may be the weakest at the moment among other stateless people who are next on the chopping block, but it doesn't stop with us. And if there is one overriding lesson in Jewish history, it's that systems without laws and rules that protect minority and the rights of others and that rely just on the law of the jungle, that doesn't work out very well, not least for minorities like the Jews of the world or Palestinians or anyone else. So that's where I see the clearest intersections. This is there is, of course, a struggle for Palestinian freedom that is a unique struggle, but is also part and parcel of an effort to create a world where people are genuinely protected, regardless to what their religion is, what their ethnicity is, and we're moving further and further away from that by the day, and it feels that things are accelerating. Mm-hmm. So I wanted to underscore the urgency of this. And you're right to recall Omar's comments as he was talking. I was nodding along a lot. I think we're at a place today in Palestine that is very, very grave. Mm-hmm. I hope and pray that it doesn't go in this direction. But the analyst in me, the realist in me, sees that as an increasingly likely possibility, that we may soon see violence directed at Palestinians that makes the last year and a half pale in comparison. But we need to be very clear-eyed about this threat, right? It's hard to kind of wrap our heads So I think it calls for a level of engagement and activism and work that is beyond what we've been willing to do before, what we've been comfortable doing before, and something that is grounded in that urgency. You know, I would love to see the kind of change that we all want to see here in the United States and on the global stage happen quickly. It may not. It may be a longer project in the making. I don't know that Palestinians have the time to wait for that to happen, especially with everything that is arrayed against them at this time. So there needs to be a really unique focus on trying to change U.S. policy, U.S. support for Israel, and obviously the Jewish American community here plays a very important and unique role in shaping U.S. policy. And I don't need to explain that to anyone in this room. We all see it, we all understand how it works. And so in whatever ways that you can affect that you can change that you can improve that, commit to that more than you've ever committed before, because it's needed now in an urgent way.
Thank you. Is there anything on the Palestinian side of what you're thinking about what Palestinians may do now next that you want us to think about, to know about in terms of sumud, in terms of resistance, both in Palestine and here and globally?
You know, I think at the moment it seems that Palestinians are most focused on survival through this stage. Mm-hmm. The kind of threats facing Palestinians today are not at the order of magnitude that they have been in the past. And this is escalating on all fronts. And I want to really emphasize the fissures in Israeli society right now and the direction that it is taking, because as things break down, and if and should they accelerate in breaking down, the first victims in the chaos that will be targeted will be Palestinians.
Yes.
And so this is, I think, the primary focus for Palestinians at this moment, and it's hard to think beyond that, given the reality that they face.
Thank you. I'm going to ask you one other question, and then open it up to everyone. And my next question is shifting in tone a slight bit as a way of inviting in other parts of this conversation. So on the one hand, you talked about Gramsci and hegemony, the common sense. What do we take for granted? What ideas, what have we absorbed so completely that we require no coercion in order to carry out particular ideological agendas? And hegemony does break down. So hold that thought on the one side, on one hand. And on the other, you have been in this movement for a long time. You were born into this world and this thinking, and you've been in this movement as a scholar, a researcher, an organizer, a policy analyst, an advocate. So you've seen a lot of transformation. You've seen hegemonic agreement shift, and you have also seen people undergo particular transformations. There are people who you used to debate, they would be on the opposite side of you in a debate, and now they're with you on the same side in debates, which is amazing to witness. It's incredible to see people change their minds in public, actually. I think it's something that is inspiring for all of us. And so I want to ask you, often those of us who have undergone our own transformations, and Simone started this morning talking a little bit about hers, often what we talk about in terms of what have been turning points for us, people have a million turning points, but speaking to and listening to Palestinians, reading Palestinian texts, thinking about Palestinian narratives is really a fundamental a moment that people who undergo transformation, they call upon. They talk about what happens to them when they actually have the opportunity and take it seriously to listen to Palestinians. And so I want to ask you, as someone who has been in this movement for so long, what do you see as shifting people? What are some moments of transformation that what can you tell us as a room full of people who want to hear the Jewish left about what you think it takes to shift people, to open them? You're asking us to do our work in shifting American Jewish relationships to US power as it relates to Israel. So what do you see in terms of what works to help people move away from, and by people I mean, I'm asking specifically about Jews, if there's something you've observed that you want to tell us, and also what it looks like for people who are not Jewish to shift in their relationships to Israel, Palestine, and US power.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think I'll answer this by kind of going on a bit of a tangent, but I promise I will come back. So when I'm not doing this most of the time, I'm a full-time hockey dad, okay? So
as anyone who follows you on X knows.
So most of my time outside of this is running around to various hockey rinks around the country with my son, and that has in part helped me stay sane, but also given me a window into parts of American life to which this issue is completely foreign, most of the time, not entirely, most of the time. It's an opportunity to engage with people who don't necessarily have a horse in the race. And what becomes so clear so quickly is how easy and quickly people get it. And I think that some of the most important work that can be done is reaching out to those types of people who aren't necessarily already on a particular side on this issue, don't really have a tremendous amount of understanding on this issue, but have a sense of decency and justice. And the vast majority of people that I've ever engaged with that are not, within the spaces that we're all so familiar with on this issue, do. Doing the work that reaches beyond these spaces, don't underestimate the capacity of people who aren't informed about this to get it very quickly. That's, I think, number one. Number two is do the work to bring people like that into conversation with or be exposed to Palestinians. You'd be amazed, or maybe you won't be amazed, at how many people have never met a Palestinian in their life. Right. It's I mentioned a couple moments in the talk that I think have been transformative in a lot of ways for the people who've been paying attention, like the different iterations of the wars on Gaza over time. Also for those who have somewhat been paying attention. But the vast majority of people will get it right away if they're reached. And reaching beyond these circles, I think, is a really big part of how we continue to create that change.
Great, thank you. Questions? Thank you. Please.
Hello. Thank you so much for that lecture and that presentation. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the failure of the international system to stop the genocide, what that failure has meant, what it's looked like. Obviously, as you pointed out, Biden was just lying through his teeth about supporting a rules-based order while also funding the genocide. Now Trump doesn't care. But I was wondering, given the importance of international bodies to legislate, or even the potential importance to support a rules-based order, I'm wondering if you could offer even more of a critique of what has failed so dramatically, and then perhaps point to what we could be reconstructing in a new vision or a beginning of a new vision of the international rules-based order.
I mean, where to even start? So many of these systems have failed. As I noted in the talk, there's long been a critique of this too, right? It's not just now. But I think the clearest moments are U.S. behavior at the United Nations, over and over again being the lone veto, even when it's partners who it's allies with in the so-called effort to uphold that rules-based order elsewhere are all voting for a ceasefire, the United States is the lone no vote. And that continued time and again. And we've heard people in the Biden administration come out and say, you know, there was probably a moment where we could have pushed for the ceasefire much earlier, and we failed to do that, right? Those, I think, are some of the most sort of profound moments. But it's not just at those highest levels of international organizations. It's all the way through. The International Criminal Court, I mean, they finally came out with these arrest warrants. It took forever to get there, right? And even before that, right, we had the United States attacking the International Criminal Court so that they wouldn't do that, right? And the list, I mean, goes on and on. We can talk about the failures within sort of, within journalism. We could talk for days about the failures within journalism, not just to adequately bring information and truth out of Gaza, but also to stand up for colleagues who are being systematically eliminated in Gaza by the Israeli military at a record pace, right? So many of these institutions that are supposed to uphold this order have failed catastrophically in this moment. So it feels like a bigger turning point than before to me.
Thank you. Please.
Thanks. In view of the view you've expressed, and many people have, about the Biden administration's failures in this area, one response on the part of Arabs, Muslims, also progressive Jews and non-Jews, was just to say, everything is so bad, we are going to sit out this election. We are not going to vote for Biden. We are not going to vote for Trump. Not realizing that a vote for not for Biden is a vote for Trump, not Biden, Harris in this case. And I can understand sort of you didn't want to pick the lesser of two evils, but the result was, from the viewpoint of the United States in general, it's worse for a lot of the country for a lot of reasons now than it would be if Kamala Harris had taken over. It may not be better for the Palestinians. And I don't want to, you're not an emissary for the Arab, Palestinian, or Muslim communities who are no more monolithic than Jewish or any other communities. But what were people thinking they were going to get if they sat out the election?
So I think a couple things that I would say in relation to that. You're right. The Arab and Muslim community is not monolithic. Voting behavior there is as varied as it is in a lot of other places. I would also point out that people who did not vote for Biden or Harris this time around, that voted for Democrats previously, are not limited to Arabs and Muslims. And the people who voted in that way because of the administration's policy on Israel, probably the vast majority of them were not Arabs and Muslims. And that's, I think, really important to remember. The other thing that I point out is that this was the choice that was presented to the Arab and Muslim community, or let's call them the Palestine voter community, those who care about Palestine in the United States, who are from all different backgrounds. This choice was presented to them in 2020. Vote for the lesser evil. Many of them did, and they got genocide. And so it's hard to make that argument again to those folks, right? So I think that piece is important. Lastly, I would say in an era of hyper-partisanship in the United States, there's no clearer bipartisan policy than the destruction of Palestine on any issue. And so, there's a much bigger conversation to be had about voting behavior and strategy over time. But I think it's important to keep those things in mind when we are trying to understand what has been going through the minds of many people here in the United States that feel that neither party is doing the right thing. And at the same time, that the decisions that they've made previously to vote for one party or another has not made a difference.
Are there other questions? I'm going to,
Fellow over
over
here,
there.
over
Oh,
here.
over
Don't
there,
forget
and then
that side,
Simone.
yeah.
There's. Hi. Simone. That's Miko.
Hi, my name is Miko, and I'm a PhD student at the University of Toronto, and I really appreciate how you tied what's happening in this moment to the invasion of Iraq in 2003, and in particular, in thinking about some of the movements that have been named today, A Land for All, others that are thinking about confederative or other approaches in Israel-Palestine today that might lead towards a less violent future between Jews and Palestinians. My question is, where do you see the role of the broader Middle East sphere, other or Arab regimes that have a kind of symbiotic relationship with Israel today? And how do we think about building political solutions as Jews, as Palestinians, that also have an analysis of the power relations in the broader Middle East and don't just have a kind of particularized understanding of Israel-Palestine?
Yeah, it's a really important question. I mean, you know, the regimes in the region are largely part of a shared security infrastructure that is entirely reliant on Washington. You know, that's been the reality for a long time and shaped a lot of policies by these different regimes. There's been tensions in that, of course, but that fundamental architecture remains the same. And, you know, it shapes a lot of outcomes, but it also has its limits. There's a conversation happening right now about what, you know, Donald Trump's vision for Gaza. Many of you may have seen the AI video that was put out by the president's social media account. And this is, I think, an idea that clearly cuts against the national interests of many governments in the region and will test the extent to which, you know, that security architecture really defines outcomes. These tensions have always existed. We've seen them at different moments. And you know, the unfortunate reality is in the region that beyond Palestine, many people in the region don't really have the rights to express themselves within their own countries. That their will is not really represented by the policies of their governments, especially as it relates to their government's relationship with Israel and their government's relationship with the United States. And you know, that continues to be a key characteristic of the entire region. And one of the reasons why, you know, the picture that I painted was obviously very grim. I think it's a reality. But I also think that the states in the region realize the danger of these schemes. Not necessarily because they care tremendously about Palestinians, their people might, but because they understand that the vast majority of chaos and destabilization in the region over the last 80 years has been a function of the ethnic cleansing of Palestinians. And a continuation of that is not going to be good for the region. So I think, yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Jeremy.
I'm going to put on my audience hat. So first of all, thank you. One topic that we haven't talked about, and it sort of threads the needle between Omer's comments this morning about effective mechanisms for putting pressure on Israel, is BDS, boycott, divest, and sanctions. And I want you to sort of lay out your thinking about BDS in two respects. One, as a sort of advocate, somebody who's done a lot of work thinking about it, and make the argument, because it's a very divisive issue among the Jewish community, but it's sort of characterized oftentimes in a shallow way. So give us the nuanced argument for this as a non-violent method of social and political change. And then second, as an analyst, right? What have been the achievements? What are some of the limitations? What is the future of BDS as one central strategy of the movement to improve Palestinian human rights?
Thank you. I appreciate the question, Jeremy. You know, for years doing this work, speaking to audiences like this, one of the questions you always get at the end, it's not about BDS, but is about, well, what can we do? How can we create change? In a context where the normal channels for representation don't seem to really work. I think you're probably all familiar with the opinion polls that recently came out, right? I think something like 33% of Democrats in the latest Gallup poll have a favorable view of Israel, 48% of independents. And yet, judging by where members of Congress stand, right, it's an alternate reality. So there's a real obstacle to translating public opinion into policy change. So one of the questions I always get is, in this context, what can we do? One of the things you can do is BDS, right? And the great thing about it is, number one, it allows you to address your own complicity on an individual level in a lot of this stuff, and at a community level, and also have achievable victories, and in the process, educate others about why change is necessary. I actually think the most important impact of BDS over this time has not been in the dollars and cents. There are important achievements there. Some of that we can talk about. Some of it is a little bit harder to measure because not all of it is necessarily reported. But the biggest achievement has been the education component. Having these conversations and debates around BDS and how to create change and what's an appropriate target, this opens up a lot of people's eyes about, okay, well, we should be doing something. What is our complicity in this? Where is our money going? Why do we have to do this, and why aren't our officials doing this instead, right? These are questions that without these kinds of campaigns, they're not being asked. And these are questions that then become asked in forums where they're not necessarily asked, right? Why would a random Presbyterian congregation in Kansas be having a conversation about Israel and Palestine if not for a divestment resolution? And yet hundreds of people pack those rooms to debate these things that they would not be talking about otherwise, precisely because those tools exist, right? So I think that has really been a very, very important component. And then if you look at sort of, the history of it over time, there's no doubt that that has been a vehicle for organizing that has built and expanded over time and led to continued organizing by growing numbers of people on all sorts of campaigns related to Palestine and beyond Palestine as well. So it has a sort of catalyzing effect. As an analyst, I would say, again, it's hard to measure some of the impacts, but there are a couple ways that we can sort of measure that. Some of them is in campaigns that have been successful. We know that there are campaigns that have been successful in kind of ending contracts, for example, ending relationships between different institutions and so on. We also have a lot of statements from Israeli officials that they don't always put out. They don't always put out in English when they do, but they acknowledge that there has been an economic impact to this sort of stuff. And there's obviously an interest to not talk about it to a great extent. We also see how much the Israeli government is investing in trying to disrupt and repress these efforts internationally. And we also see the kind of investment that allies of the Israeli government are making in trying to disrupt and repress these efforts here in the United States. I don't think you do that if it's not effective, right? But again, the single most effective component of it has been, it is a vehicle to create conversation and change and education in spaces where it otherwise would not be happening. And if not for that, the conversation ends with a very frustrated audience member having nothing to do, right? But it gives them an opportunity to continue to be engaged, to educate other people, and to achieve certain victories and continue to build a movement. So in that way, I think it is, the advent of BDS has really been something revolutionary for the Palestine solidarity movement globally.
We're done?
One short question. Okay, we take one short.
I'm going to call on Simone, who has been waiting and waiting.
Okay, I'll keep it short. BDS seems to me like also the long-term vision of like in the world that we want in past this time of monsters that we could have that. in the more immediate term, like reflecting on your talk, what do you think people can do right now to protect Palestinians, I guess, on the ground and here?
Thank you.
Everything that we're doing needs to be amplified. That's number one. But number two, I think it's important to, like, Palestinians and those of us advocating on their behalf who are either Palestinians in the United States or Arab or Muslim or otherwise perceived to be, are at an increased risk for repression, right? And I think that particularly among the Jewish community in the United States, those who want to see change in U.S. policy, there's not no risk, obviously, but there is a degree of privilege that you have and bring into those spaces that those of us who don't have that background, don't have that identity, can't rely on to be protected. And so I think, you know, for these audiences in particular, that's a really important thing to keep in mind at this time, especially as the efforts to kind of silence and repress, these go hand in hand, by the way. The violence that we're seeing directed at Palestinians is going to be possible, will continue to be possible because of the kind of coercion and repression that is going to be directed here at those who want to end support for those policies on the ground, right? These are connected playing fields. And here, as accusations of anti-Semitism continue to go into overdrive, those who care about the human rights of Palestinians, who care about protecting life on the ground over there, have a very, very important role to play. And I will just leave it at that.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone.